Matthew Evans, a wealthy businessman in his late 70s, was no stranger to luxury and convenience. Throughout his life he had built an empire in finance, ensuring that he never had to worry about the small inconveniences of everyday life. However, on that sweltering Kentucky afternoon, he found himself in an unfamiliar situation. Stranded on the side of a quiet road with a flat tire and no cell service. His sleek silver Mercedes, a symbol of his success, now sat useless, its deflated tire a stark reminder that no amount of wealth could prevent the unpredictable mishaps of life. Frustrated, Matthew tried calling roadside assistance multiple times, but with no luck. He sighed heavily, tapping his fingers impatiently on the steering wheel, resigned to the fact that he would have to wait indefinitely. Just as his frustration began to mount, a lone figure appeared in the distance. A young boy, no older than 13 or 14, was walking along the road, his faded t-shirt clinging to his frame in the oppressive heat. His sneakers were worn, the soles barely holding together, yet there was a confidence in his stride that caught Matthew's attention. As the boy approached, he took a quick look at the car and then turned his gaze to Matthew, offering a polite but assured nod. "Got a flat, sir?" the boy asked, his voice steady and unbothered by the summer heat. Matthew, momentarily taken aback by the boy's presence and composure, nodded. "Yes, I do. I was hoping for some help, but my phone has no signal out here," he admitted, his usual authoritative tone softened by the unfamiliar situation. The boy gave a small, knowing smile. "I can help with that," he said, crouching beside the tire without hesitation. "My grandpa taught me how to change a tire last summer. Do you have a spare?" Still processing the situation, Matthew gestured toward the trunk, watching as the boy confidently retrieved the tools and spare tire. In a matter of minutes, the young stranger worked with quiet efficiency, his hands moving swiftly as if he had done this countless times before. As Matthew observed him, an unfamiliar feeling crept in. He, a man who had spent decades commanding boardrooms and managing millions, was now depending on a boy with little more than a kind heart and a willingness to help. As Matthew watched the boy work swiftly and confidently, he felt a sense of humility he hadn't experienced in years. This young stranger, who had no obligation to help him, didn't hesitate to offer his time and effort without expecting anything in return. The boy's hands moved with quiet precision, his focus unwavering as he tightened the last lug nut. Note, despite his worn-out sneakers and faded t-shirt, there was an air of dignity about him, a quiet strength that Matthew found both surprising and admirable. When the boy finally stood up, wiping his hands on his jeans, he gave Matthew a small, satisfied smile. "All done," he said simply, stepping back to admire his work. Matthew reached into his wallet, instinctively pulling out a few crisp bills. "Here, take this," he said, holding the money out to the boy. "I really appreciate your help." The boy, however, did something that left Matthew stunned. He took a step back and raised his hand in polite refusal. "Thank you, sir," he said, shaking his head, "but I don't need anything, just happy to help." Matthew blinked, momentarily speechless. He had spent his life in a world where every interaction had a price, where favors were exchanged with an unspoken expectation of something in return. The idea that someone would offer help without expecting compensation was almost foreign to him. He had encountered countless businessmen, investors, and colleagues, but few, if any, had ever extended such pure, unselfish kindness. As the boy turned and walked away, his figure growing smaller in the distance, Matthew felt an unfamiliar sense of reflection settle over him. He slipped the money back into his wallet, but the interaction left a lasting impression. The boy could have easily taken the money, but he didn't. He could have ignored the situation altogether, but instead he chose to help. Driving home, Matthew's mind kept drifting back to the encounter. The boy's quiet confidence, his unwillingness to accept payment, and his simple act of kindness unsettled something deep within him. For the first time in a long while, Matthew found himself questioning the values he had built his life upon. What was wealth without purpose? What was success if it lacked generosity? The boy had given him more than just a fixed tire. He had given him a reason to reflect. The image of the boy walking away with nothing but a smile stayed with Matthew long after he returned home. That night, as he sat in his grand study, surrounded by expensive leather-bound books and the soft ticking of an antique grandfather clock, he found himself restless. His untouched dinner sat beside him, a perfectly cooked steak that suddenly felt unappetizing. The wealth and luxury that had once brought him satisfaction now felt hollow in the face of a simple act of kindness. He had spent decades amassing fortune, securing properties and making powerful business deals, yet something about that boy's selfless gesture had unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite explain. The next morning, Matthew found himself unable to let go of the encounter. He needed to understand more about the boy who had helped him, not for the sake of rewarding him, but because he felt compelled to. For years, Matthew had seen the world through a transactional lens. Every action, every relationship was built on an exchange of value. But this boy had shattered that perception in an instant. Who was he? What kind of upbringing led to such generosity? What values shaped him to give so freely without expecting anything in return? Determined to find answers, Matthew retraced his steps, driving back to the lonely stretch of road where he had been stranded the day before. He stopped at gas stations, small diners and roadside businesses, describing the boy to anyone who would listen. Most people shrugged, unable to help, until finally, at a small cafe, an elderly woman behind the counter wiped her hands on her apron and said, "Sounds like you're talking about Elijah." Elijah. The name felt significant, as if it already carried weight in Matthew's mind. "Do you know where he lives?" he asked. The woman nodded. "He and his mother live over in Harlan. Good kid, always helping folks out." Harlan, a small town nestled in the foothills of the Appalachians, nearly an hour away. Without hesitation, Matthew set off, navigating winding roads and picturesque hills, his heart racing with anticipation. He didn't fully understand why he was doing this, but something deep inside him told him that meeting Elijah again might give him an answer to questions he hadn't even thought to ask. When Matthew finally arrived in Harlan, the town was quiet, a stark contrast to the busy city life he was used to. The streets were lined with small businesses, modest homes, and people who greeted each other like family. It didn't take long for him to find someone who knew Elijah. Everyone seemed to know him. Following the directions he was given, Matthew soon found himself in front of a small but well-kept house on the edge of town. The porch sagged slightly under its weight and the paint was chipped in places, but there was a warmth about the home that made it inviting. Taking a deep breath, Matthew knocked on the door. A woman in her early 40s answered, her tired eyes sharp and filled with curiosity as she took in the sight of the older, well-dressed man standing on her porch. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice polite but cautious. Matthew cleared his throat. "Good morning. I'm sorry to bother you, but I believe I met your son yesterday. Elijah. He helped me with a flat tire and I just wanted to thank him properly." The woman's expression softened instantly. "That sounds like my Elijah," she said with a small smile. "He's always helping folks." She stepped aside and motioned for Matthew to enter. "He's out back if you'd like to wait." Stepping into the house, Matthew took in his surroundings. The furniture was old but clean, the walls decorated with family photos and hand-drawn pictures, likely from a much younger Elijah. The house carried a lived-in warmth that felt more welcoming than the cold grandeur of his own mansion. For years, Matthew had filled his home with expensive decor, yet it lacked the simple love and authenticity he saw in this space. As they made their way outside, they found Elijah working on repairing the backyard fence, his small hands gripping a hammer with practiced ease. He looked up and, seeing Matthew, gave a surprised but friendly smile. "Hey, mister," he greeted. "What are you doing here?" Matthew smiled, feeling an unfamiliar nervousness settle in. "I wanted to thank you again. You helped me when I really needed it, and I just couldn't stop thinking about it." Elijah shrugged, brushing dust off his jeans. It wasn't a big deal, but to Matthew it was, and he realized that for the first time in years he had encountered someone who had given him something he could never put a price on. Humility. As Matthew sat on the worn but sturdy porch of Elijah's home, he reflected on how different this place was from his own. The house, though small, radiated warmth. The furniture was old but well cared for. The kitchen smelled of freshly baked bread and laughter echoed through the walls. It was a stark contrast to his own lavish home, where silence filled the vast hallways, broken only by the occasional hum of an expensive sound system or the clinking of a glass against marble countertops. For all his wealth and success, he had never felt as grounded and present as he did at that moment. Elijah's mother, her eyes filled with quiet strength, placed a plate of food in front of him. "It's not much, but you're welcome to join us," she said with a kind smile. Matthew hesitated for a moment, unaccustomed to such simple gestures of hospitality. But as he looked at Elijah, who sat across from him grinning, he realized this was more than just a meal. It was an invitation into their world. He accepted with a grateful nod. Throughout lunch, Matthew listened as Elijah excitedly talked about his school, his friends, and his love for building things. His mother spoke about the community, the struggles they had faced, and how they had learned to find joy in the little things. They weren't bitter about what they lacked. Instead, they took pride in what they had. It was a lesson in gratitude that Matthew hadn't realized he needed. As they finished eating, Matthew turned to Elijah's mother, his voice sincere. "You've raised a remarkable young man. His kindness, it's something special." She smiled, her eyes glistening with emotion. "Thank you. We've had our struggles, but we always try to look out for each other. That's what truly matters." Matthew nodded, his heart heavy with realization. He had spent a lifetime accumulating wealth, believing it would bring him happiness. Yet, sitting in this modest home, sharing a meal with people who had so little, yet gave so much, he felt richer than he ever had before. As he left that afternoon, Matthew knew he couldn't just walk away. He had been given a gift, one that he had no choice but to pass forward. Elijah's simple act of kindness had set something in motion, and Matthew was determined to honor it. Matthew had spent decades believing that wealth was the ultimate measure of success. He had built his empire, acquired luxury, and ensured financial security for generations to come. Yet, for all his accomplishments, something had always been missing. It wasn't until he met Elijah, a young boy with nothing but a generous heart, that he realized what he had overlooked. The true purpose of success was not accumulation, but giving back. Returning to his sprawling estate, Matthew couldn't shake the thought of Elijah and his mother. Their resilience, their kindness, and the warmth of their modest home lingered in his mind. He knew that simply giving them money wouldn't be enough. Charity wasn't the answer. Instead, he wanted to invest in them, just as he had once invested in businesses. He wanted to create opportunities that would help them build a better future, not just for themselves, but for their entire community. The next morning, Matthew made a series of phone calls. He reached out to contractors, architects, and educators. He set in motion plans to renovate Elijah's home. Not out of pity, but out of respect. He saw potential in Elijah, and he wanted to nurture it. By the end of the week, trucks rolled into town, workers arrived, and the transformation began. Elijah was astonished when he saw what was happening. "Mr. Matthew, you didn't have to do this," he said, eyes wide with disbelief. Matthew placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Neither did you," he replied with a smile. "But you did. You helped me, expecting nothing in return. That's what makes the world better, Elijah. Not money, but people helping each other." As the house was repaired and upgraded, Matthew also made arrangements for Elijah's education. He connected him with mentors in engineering and construction, recognizing the boy's natural talent. Over the following months, Elijah's enthusiasm grew, and his dreams became more tangible. But the biggest change was in Matthew himself. He found himself returning to Harlan frequently, not as a benefactor, but as a friend. He spent time with Elijah's family, engaged with the community, and realized that giving back didn't diminish his wealth, it enriched his life in ways he had never imagined. For the first time in years, Matthew felt at peace. He had spent his life chasing numbers, but now he was building something far greater, a legacy of kindness, gratitude, and meaningful change. As the renovations on Elijah's home neared completion, Matthew found himself reflecting on how much his own life had changed in such a short time. For years, he had equated success with material wealth, yet no amount of money had ever made him feel as fulfilled as seeing Elijah's family smile in gratitude. This was no longer about charity. It was about connection, about recognizing the value in people rather than possessions. One evening, as Matthew watched Elijah eagerly measure wood alongside the construction workers, he realized the boy wasn't just grateful, he was inspired. Matthew had given him the opportunity to see what was possible beyond his current circumstances. That realization struck Matthew deeply. For all his financial success, he had never considered the impact he could have beyond boardrooms and investments. Elijah had changed that. During a quiet moment on the newly rebuilt porch, Elijah's mother sat beside Matthew, a cup of tea in her hands. "You've done more than fix this house," she said softly. "You've given us hope. And I think you've found something too." Matthew nodded, his voice steady. "I have," he admitted. "I spent my life believing that wealth was the end goal, but this," he gestured toward the home, the yard filled with life and laughter, "this is what truly matters." In the weeks that followed, Matthew made a decision. He didn't just want to help Elijah's family, he wanted to create opportunities for others like them. He reached out to local community leaders, proposing a scholarship program for children from underprivileged backgrounds who showed promise in engineering, business, and other fields. He connected with organizations that could provide mentorship and vocational training. His wealth had always been a tool, but now he would use it to build something lasting. Elijah's story became the first of many. His home was just the beginning of Matthew's newfound purpose. He no longer cared about status or luxury. He cared about making a difference, and in doing so, he discovered a peace he had never known before. Years later, as he sat watching Elijah graduate with honors, Matthew knew he had done something far greater than accumulating wealth. He had built a legacy of kindness, generosity, and purpose, and that, he realized, was the greatest investment of his life. Years had passed since the day Elijah had stopped to help Matthew with his flat tire, yet the impact of that brief encounter continued to unfold in ways neither of them could have predicted. What began as a simple act of kindness had blossomed into a life-changing journey for both men. Matthew, once a wealthy businessman focused solely on personal success, had found a new purpose in giving back, while Elijah, the humble boy with a heart full of generosity, had grown into a young man determined to make a difference in his own way. Matthew's investment in Elijah's future extended beyond renovating his home. He had taken the boy under his wing, introducing him to mentors, providing him with opportunities, and most importantly, reinforcing the belief that his kindness and work ethic would take him far in life. Elijah had never asked for anything in return for helping that day on the roadside, yet he received more than he could have imagined. A guiding hand that helped him carve out a promising future. As Elijah pursued his studies in engineering, he carried Matthew's lessons with him. Inspired by the generosity he had experienced, he sought ways to give back to his own community. He started volunteering, tutoring younger students who didn't have access to proper educational support. He worked on small construction projects for families in need, using the skills he had learned while watching the workers rebuild his home. He understood now, better than ever, that true success was not measured in wealth, but in how many lives one could touch along the way. Matthew, too, had changed. The once lonely man confined to his mansion and wealth now spent his days actively involved in community projects, establishing mentorship programs and funding scholarships for students with big dreams but limited resources. His heart, once solely driven by financial gain, now found fulfillment in seeing others thrive. One evening, as the two sat together on the same porch they had rebuilt years ago, Elijah looked at Matthew and smiled. "You know, Mr. Matthew, I always thought that helping you that day was just about changing a tire. But it turns out, it changed my life." Matthew chuckled, shaking his head. "It changed mine too, Elijah, and I think we both learned something important. Kindness has a way of coming full circle." Indeed, their story was proof that a single act of kindness could ripple outward, shaping not just one life, but many. As we journey through life, we often realize that the most meaningful moments are not defined by wealth, status, or possessions, but by the impact we have on others. The story of Matthew and Elijah reminds us that true generosity comes from the heart, and even the smallest act of kindness can create ripples that extend far beyond what we can see. For those in their golden years, this lesson is particularly profound. Many have spent decades building careers, raising families, and navigating the challenges of life. But in the quiet moments of reflection, what remains most valuable are not the accolades or material success, but the relationships we've nurtured and the kindness we've shown. Helping others, whether through mentorship, sharing wisdom, or simple gestures of goodwill, brings a deep sense of fulfillment that no amount of money can buy. Matthew, despite his financial success, found himself feeling empty until he encountered a young boy who expected nothing in return for his help. Elijah's selflessness reminded him of a truth he had long forgotten. Life's greatest wealth is found in connection, generosity, and purpose. Similarly, in our own lives, taking time to uplift others, whether a friend, a neighbor, or a stranger, can bring immeasurable joy and renewal. As we age, our influence takes on a different form, but it is no less powerful. Sharing life experiences, guiding younger generations, and fostering community bonds can leave a lasting legacy. The story of Matthew and Elijah teaches us that it is never too late to rediscover what truly matters, and that, in giving to others, we find a deeper sense of meaning in our own lives.